So good morning, everyone, joining us today throughout the country to discuss the important topic of culturally inclusive disaster management. My name is Antoine Chandonnet, apologies for the tricky French name to pronounce, and I'm recovery coordinator for Australian Red Cross in Queensland. So welcome to all of you. I will be your virtual host this morning. So to start our event, I would like to call on Mr. Peter Binks, who is Vice President of Industry and External Engagement for Griffith University. And Griffith University has kindly let us use their brand new disaster management and resilience facilities to have our event today. So we're very grateful to have our event from here. So Mr. Binks, please.
Antoine, thank you so much. And the kindness we think is actually coming from the Australian Red Cross for involving us in this occasion. Let me welcome you all here on what we see as a really auspicious and important event, a really critical discussion. I'm going to commence, though, first of all, by acknowledging on behalf of Griffith University, the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. In our case, at Nathan Campus, it is the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge the many different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands from across the country and their peoples who are joining us via the Zoom, or the countries from which the Zoom attendees are joining us. So on behalf of Griffith University, I'd like to welcome the numerous participants here today. First of all, I was going to welcome the Honourable Leanne Linnard, Member for Nudgee, Queensland Minister for Children and Youth Justice and Minister for Multicultural Affairs. As you're aware, Minister Linnard is indisposed today, but we will have her speech read out later on. But we thank her for her support and her participation, and we're very much looking forward to hearing her key messages. We wish you well and a rapid recovery. I also want to acknowledge many of the other dignitaries here today, and there are many indeed. But let me first acknowledge Mr. Gary Page, the State Director of the Australian Red Cross. Welcome here, Gary. It's lovely to see you here. This may be your first time here, I'm not sure, but I'm delighted and hope we can get to work with you more closely. Mr. Colin Sovalingam. Colin, wonderful to see you again. Emergency Services Manager of the Australian Red Cross. We are building a very healthy and productive relationship with you, and we look forward to continuing to do so. And Brendan Moon, State Recovery Coordinator and CEO of Queensland Reconstruction Authority. Brendan, we're doing a lot of work together at the moment, and we're enormously grateful for the opportunity to do so. And we're singularly grateful for your funding support and guidance and coordination for this particular effort. That's been a really notable contribution. Thank you for that. There are attendees today from a whole variety of multicultural and non-government organisations, too few to name specifically, but I welcome you. I thank you for your participation. You're extraordinarily valued members of this conversation. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here. And of course, the author of this very important report, Antoine Chandonnet, State Recovery Coordinator of the Australian Red Cross. Delighted to have you here. Wonderful to see your work, and congratulations on this wonderful report. I've only had a chance to briefly peruse this report, but I'm struck by a couple of things. The engagement that you have driven with the community, the communities involved and the practitioners is really important. Rather than delivering policy on high, you have gone down deep and worked very closely with the key people involved in that. In terms of the directions of the report, the focus on equity and emergency management is really important, and something that perhaps we've not paid full attention to in the past. And the development of a true community-centred approach is notable, and we're really pleased with that. So we commend you on both commissioning and conducting this research, and we believe it will play an important role in better equipping our communities to prepare for impending disasters. Acknowledging the organisers of the launch here today, Antoine again, and Donna Steele from the Red Cross Australia, thank you for your efforts to bring this together. Cheryl Desher, Nancy Spencer, who've done so much work to bring this facility here and allow this to happen. Nancy, as you know, is Executive in Residence at the Griffith Business School, and the Griffith Business School is a really important contributor to that. And Britt Winnan from the Office of Research has also contributed mightily. I'm not going to talk I'm not going to talk about Griffith as such, but I will talk about how universities are playing a remarkably different role. And I think I speak on behalf of all universities, not just Griffith, to say that we are moving into a mode where we work with and alongside the community in a way that perhaps we have not done so before. And we seek to do that further, and we are grateful for your bringing us into the party and involving us here. And then finally, I want to say something about Red Cross and what a pleasure it is to work alongside an organisation that I've admired for just about all of my working life. You are one of the preeminent global organisations. You are admired and loved across the world. You have been in Australia now for, I think it's, 117 years active? 107 years maybe, and made a remarkable impact. And I think the note I wanted to end up on was that I've watched the history of Red Cross and see how you've moved from support of people who are directly involved in wartime activities and their partners and families to being a much broader organisation. And I noted the 8 points of your charter and how number one on that was preparing and equipping communities to cope with crises. And I applaud that vision, and we would be delighted to work alongside you with that. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we had a few comments that the sound was not very clear, so I'll try to speak a bit more loudly to make sure that everyone on the line can hear us. So hopefully it will be a bit better. I just wanted to thank you again to the Griffith University to host us for our event today, and just like to mention that already quite significant events have taken place right here in this facility, including a significant flood recovery event that happened last month, I think, bringing together stakeholders from disaster management at large. So we're very grateful. Once again, thank you very much for hosting us. Sorry, I'm doing this at the same time. So we have a very full program today with keynote speakers, presentation, and conversations with various people who in very different ways contribute to disaster-led management, to a community-led disaster management, apologies. So thank you all for being here today. I think your presence online and in person shows a real commitment to people-centered approach to disaster management. Because of our busy program, we unfortunately will not have time for questions. However, the chat is active, so I really encourage you to use it. We're curious to hear about your thoughts, your comments, and if any of what will be discussed today resonate with you in any way. And as Peter mentioned, we have people joining from very different sectors, from disaster management, migration support, community development, and others. So feel free to use this opportunity to connect with other people on the line. So today's event is about culturally inclusive disaster management. But before we dive into this topic, I thought it'd be useful to remind ourselves of a few ways in which the disaster management sector has evolved in the past few years. Now, first and foremost, and unfortunately is starting to be kind of a standard thing to say, we are facing an increased frequency and intensity in disasters. And I'm saying this at the moment where New South Wales is once again hit by quite major flooding, and where my home country, Canada, is also hit by floods, which the Premier of British Columbia called a 1 in a 500-year event with, unfortunately, loss of lives. And another way in which the disaster management has evolved is that it's having to face new challenges. And I'm, of course, here talking about COVID-19, which not only created its own problem, but also brought an additional layer of complexity to the work that disaster managers are doing, both in response and recovery. And we'll discuss later with one of our colleagues here the implication of COVID-19 for culturally appropriate communication. And finally, another way in which the disaster management sector has evolved is that it increasingly embeds community-led and people-centered approach to disaster management, which simply put, really means putting human beings at the center of disaster management rather than the infrastructure, the economy, or anything else. And I think an important part of those community-led and people-centered approach is the inclusion of culture and language into disaster management. And I think it's a good moment to remind ourselves that nearly a third of the Australian population is born overseas. That's 7.5 million people, a lot of people, who came to Australia temporarily or permanently for a whole range of reasons, to work, to study, to reunite with family, but also to escape from violence, conflict, and persecution. So there's no doubt that multiculturalism is a defining feature of Australian society, with implications for pretty much all aspects of life, including, of course, for disaster management, which is what we will be discussing today. So today's event is not so much about showcasing a particular project or particular research, but really about discussing how we can make disaster management more culturally inclusive, and I would say as well more culturally competent. So as I mentioned, we have quite a busy agenda. The plan is to start with a message from the Honourable Minister Leanne Linnard, Minister for Children and Youth Justice and Minister for Multicultural Affairs. We'll then have keynote addresses from Mr. Brendan Moon from the Queensland Reconstruction Authority and Mr. Gary Page from Australian Red Cross. We'll then have a brief conversation with Mr. Colin Sivalingam, State Manager for Emergency Services in Queensland, to really tell the story of how that engagement with CALD communities started in Queensland. Following this, I will share some insights of the research that we are presenting today. We'll then have a conversation with Dr. Paul Schmidt, who will share some quite important learnings about culturally appropriate communication in the very complex context of COVID-19. And last but not least, we'll be showcasing some current initiatives that are taking place right now that engage with culturally diverse community on disaster resilience. So that's quite a busy program. And I'm very aware that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So 90 minutes is probably the maximum that we can ask from your busy schedule. We are scheduled to finish at 11 a.m. for Queenslanders and noon for people in the southern states. And for the people who were not able to join today, this session will be recorded for later viewing. So first of all, I'd like to welcome on the stage Mr. Gary Page, who will share a message from Minister Leanne Linnard, Minister for Multicultural Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. I'm sure if the Minister was here, she would obviously acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we all meet here today. I've always wanted to be a Minister of the Crown, and a female one is always of interest. So pretend I am the Minister. And I give this message after accepting clearly the apology from the Minister, who would have loved to have been with us, at least in video, if not in person here today, and is unable to do so. So we appreciate the message coming from the Minister. So from Leanne Linnard, MP, Minister for Children and Youth Justice and Minister for Multicultural Affairs. Congratulations to the Australian Red Cross on the official launch of their Emergency Resilience in Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Communities research report. My thanks to Red Cross for undertaking this important piece of research. I have no doubt this will become a valuable resource to all agencies and organisations involved in disaster preparedness, response and recovery in Australia. Queensland is proud to have one of the world's most culturally diverse populations, where almost 2 in 5 Queenslanders were either born overseas or had at least one parent born overseas. We know that some Queenslanders are more likely to be impacted during disasters than others, including people with limited English, those unfamiliar with Australia's environment, and people who have previously experienced trauma. Culturally and linguistically diverse communities are often referred to as vulnerable, but this report highlights the incredible strength and extraordinary resilience of the many migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers who call Queensland home. The Red Cross research emphasises that by focusing on existing strengths and skills, we can better harness the collective spirit that exists in culturally and linguistically diverse communities, so everyone is better prepared and ready to survive disasters. Difficult times show us how important it is for all community members to come together to use their skills and experiences to help their local community respond, recover, and thrive. On behalf of the Queensland Government, I congratulate everybody involved in this important piece of research. On behalf of the Honourable Leanne Linnard MP, Minister for Children and Youth Justice, and importantly, Minister for Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you very much, Gary, for sharing that message. And obviously a big thank you to the Queensland Government for providing the funding that made this project possible. I'd now like to call on Mr. Brendan Moon, Chief Executive Officer for the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. Brendan?
Thank you, Antoine. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. To Peter Binks from Griffith University, thank you for the use of your facility once again. And I think it's an important time that we recognise the input and the enrichment of the disaster management space now that through the relationship with Griffith University and other universities throughout Queensland, and they are now starting to play an increasingly important part in the disaster management space in which we operate. To Gary Page from the Australian Red Cross and his team, who we've stood together with through so many crises over the past 10 years in supporting recovery and building and nurturing the resilience of our communities. It is good to see you here, and it is great to see the outcomes of your work. Thank you very much for inviting me here to be at the launch of this groundbreaking report into disaster resilience in our state's culturally and linguistically diverse communities. I'd like to congratulate the Australian Red Cross on their work in this space. Disaster resilience is something that we must all work on. We have a reputation here in Queensland as having a bias for resilience. And I think a key plank of that resilience throughout Queensland is brought about or is contributed to by the diversity of our communities. We are made up of coastal, island, remote, Indigenous, regional, metropolitan, but also culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And this diversity is one of Australia's defining features and one of its most valuable assets. Multiculturalism is a central aspect of the Australian identity, an important contributor to social, cultural, and economic dynamism. We've already heard today, with a third of the country's population born overseas and every fifth person speaking a language other than English at home, research historically would suggest that these communities are more likely to experience the impacts of natural disasters more severely. But strikingly, this report points out that CALD communities, particularly recently arrived migrants and refugees, are often incorrectly perceived to be more vulnerable because of factors such as their familiarity with the hazards and the risks that we face, and maybe those support networks that exist in the disaster management community and or their previous experiences. However, this report possesses a wealth of experience and abilities actually reside within those communities, and they will have the potential to enrich the disaster management knowledge and practices in Australia, not only in this season, but in the future to come. And it's important that we don't overlook this. Far from being vulnerable, many of the newcomers to Australia are in fact extraordinarily resilient, often as a result of having overcome many challenges and barriers on their journey to these shores. To help CALD communities enhance disaster resilience while contributing to more culturally inclusive disaster management, the Australian Red Cross have implemented a 2-year project focused on volunteer mobilisation community engagement and capacity building, and the development of multilingual disaster preparedness resources, whilst contributing to advocacy and also to research. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority is proud to have been able to support this program through the jointly funded State and Commonwealth Natural Disaster Resilience Program and the annual Get Ready Queensland program. Underlining the impact of this report, as many of you would know, the project was a joint winner in the community category at this year's Queensland Resilient Australia Awards, held in Brisbane earlier this month, where it was recognised for the fantastic work it's doing to increase the capacity of culturally and linguistically diverse Queenslanders to prepare for, to cope and to recover from natural disasters and other emergencies. It is a goal that is the top of mind at QRA with our Get Ready Queensland program. It reminds us that whether you've recently arrived or a long-term resident of Queensland, it's important to know that when it comes to extreme weather events, it's not a matter of if, but when. And our key messages have always been: understand your risk, have a plan, and make sure you have an emergency kit. Being prepared for a disaster doesn't just better protect individuals and their households during a disaster. Research consistently shows those that are better prepared recover more quickly. To support CALD communities, QRA is currently in the process of translating our key Get Ready Queensland resources into the 15 most commonly used languages in Queensland. Furthermore, turning words into action is important for our local governments. And as part of the Get Ready Queensland program, Toowoomba, Brisbane and Moreton Bay have used their Get Ready Queensland funding to develop local CALD strategies to underpin their Get Ready messaging. It has never been more important to ensure everyone in our community has the information and the support that they need in an emergency. Yes, we know that Queensland is the most disaster impacted state in Australia, with close to 90 events since 2010. Already this disaster season has kicked off with widespread intense rainfall and flooding, which has impacted areas in central and also southern and western Queensland. Projects like this are to be commended for helping to make our communities safer, stronger and more resilient in the face of all the challenges that Mother Nature faces. So once again, I congratulate the Australian Red Cross on their Disaster Resilience in CALD Community project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and thank you obviously for administrating the funding that made this project possible. I'd like now to call once again Mr. Gary Page, State Director for Australian Red Cross in Queensland. Please, Gary.
Thank you, Antoine. I was having such fun being the minister. Can I go back to that? I shan't. If I can acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet. I acknowledge in Brisbane the Turrbal and Jagera people. I also acknowledge the lands upon which each of you are standing today across the whole of Australia. And I do genuinely, from a heartfelt place, acknowledge the care, stewardship and love of this land over tens and tens of thousands of years, prior to colonisation and afterwards. If I can acknowledge Peter Binks, thank you for hosting us here today. It's great to have such a strong collaboration and partnership, and we look forward to working with you again as we move forward. Brendan Moon, thank you. Thank you for those words and comments. Brendan is the CEO of the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. We work collaboratively and in partnership, and we really appreciate that and the strength of our relationship. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority is the lead agency responsible for disaster recovery and resilience policy in Queensland, an incredibly important organisation. They also administer the Natural Disaster Resilience Program and numerous other funding programs for the benefit and the preparation and resilience of Queensland communities. So thank you and your organisation for all you do, Brendan. If I can acknowledge the Minister, the Honourable Leanne Linnard. We acknowledge you can't be here, but you are certainly here in spirit with us, and we very much appreciated your very warm welcome and acknowledgement of this report. If I can acknowledge the Commonwealth and Queensland governments as well for funding this research report, which is incredibly valuable. Can I acknowledge each and every one of you here online today, and thank you for giving your time and commitment to such an important topic. We encourage you to look at this research, to share this research, to talk about it, to use it as an advocacy and a lobbying tool. It is, we believe, groundbreaking, very up-to-date, contemporary, and very, very important. So I thank each and every one of you for being here from wherever you may be within Australia. So the last few years have been particularly challenging for Australia. Here in Queensland, we've experienced a rapid succession of major flooding in North Queensland, a severe drought, the worst bushfires in the history of our state, and of course, many challenges that COVID-19 has brought into our lives. Rising up to these challenges demands tremendous resilience and continuous adaptation from all of our communities, all of our government agencies, and all of our humanitarian organisations. Australian Red Cross has been at the forefront of the challenges that we face, that all communities face in so many ways. For example, following the North Queensland monsoon and floods, our emergency services program supported more than 52,000 affected community members in evacuation centres and during outreach. During the devastating 1920 bushfire season, nearly 10,000 people were supported in evacuation centres and over the phone throughout the country, whilst more than 40,000 people have now been assisted in their recovery journey through the provision of psychological first aid, training and workshops, information and referrals. Red Cross has now also distributed more than $224 million in various financial assistance grants to affected people. A huge opportunity due to the generosity of many Australian organisations, people and individuals to help those bushfire impacted organisations and entrusting Red Cross to do so. Natural disasters are of course not the only challenges Queensland communities have faced in recent years. To support communities coping with the COVID-19 pandemic, a team of over 470 dedicated volunteers and staff made more than 150,000 phone calls to support people in home and hotel quarantine, a tremendous effort. And Red Cross also provided wellness kits to support people in quarantine and continues to do so. Through our migration support program, Red Cross supports refugees, people seeking asylum, people in immigration detention, and other people who are vulnerable as a result of migration. We provide services to trace and reconnect families who have lost contact as a result of international or internal conflict, war, and disaster. Our migration programs and services protect and uphold the health, dignity, and well-being of vulnerable migrants in Australia. The project and the research outcomes being launched today at the intersection of our emergency services and our migration support programs are invaluable. It was born from both the needs and opportunities to further involve culturally and linguistically diverse Australians in disaster management and resilience, an identified gap that we wanted to help close. This project, whose outcomes will be discussed in more detail shortly, allows Red Cross, colleague agencies, and now each of you to enhance your and our understanding of migrants and refugees' experience with disasters, to importantly elevate their voices and to showcase the tremendous strengths, skills, and knowledge with which culturally diverse Australians contribute to our society. Before we proceed presenting the outcomes of this project, I would like to reiterate Red Cross's commitment to support Queenslanders affected by natural disasters and other disruptions, and our continued collaboration and partnership with communities, community leaders, government agencies, service providers, each of you and other stakeholders to bring about a more resilient community. this sort of research project and even the event today doesn't just happen. So I would really like to also acknowledge Colin and Antoine for the amazing work that they have undertaken in creating the event today, but also over the past couple of years, the development of such an invaluable research report. Please do share this report. It is contemporary, as I said, it's groundbreaking. And thank you for being with us here today for this launch event.
Thank you very much for your kind word, Gary. Very nice to have your support. So this effort of involving migrants and refugees into our disaster management work has not started yesterday. And it started thanks to people who have first identified both a need and an opportunity to do so. And one of them is here with us today, is Mr. Colin Sivalingam, State Manager for Emergency Services. And rather than address, we thought it would be a bit more lively to do a bit of a conversation. So if you can come here, Colin. So I'd just like to ask you first, how did this start? When and how did the idea of involving culturally diverse communities into the work of your program was started?
Thanks, Antoine. So often when we walk through the research piece and the project, we often forget where did this actually start. So when you asked me the question yesterday, I think, where did this actually start? And it was about 5 years ago, actually, when we had a very extensive migration support program where our MSP clients, our caseworkers, were working with newly settled refugees and asylum seekers that just arrived. And part of the work was caseworkers had to work with them in terms of settlement, have conversations. And very quickly, we realized that they had absolutely no idea about the country we are in with regard to disasters. Very quickly, we realized that the information that they receive is very different to traditional messaging that we get from authorities, from uniformed personnel, from governments, from agencies, that cultural leaders play such an important role in key messaging. We realized that when we engaged with our clients, our refugee clients, is that early warning messaging, resilience messaging, preparedness was really foreign to them in conversation. It wasn't part of the fabric. It wasn't part of what they would prepare for. So what we did very quickly is that let's try to unpack what does this mean. And we very quickly started a program asking asylum seekers and refugees, would you like to volunteer in our emergency services program and to help your communities come forward? Overwhelming response of early settlements of refugees and asylum seekers that want to get involved in community, want to do something, and want to actually translate messaging. So at that stage, we did not have any documents or preparedness messaging was translated in any form of language. So we had volunteers that were clients of Red Cross. On one side, we're supporting, we're actually volunteering to translate traditional messaging into their own community in various different languages. Bit of a trial and error process because we had to make sure the message was the right message out there. Very quickly, we realized that trust of information is utmost important. We also realized that communities were more resilient than we actually thought, especially coming from conflict areas and communities where they experience disasters very differently. And there was overwhelming response to actually get involved. So at that stage, we said, this is a time maybe we should start a project based on a volunteer model. And we started a program really of recruiting volunteers from different cultural backgrounds into the program. And that's where the project started. And it actually helped us to where we are today. We quickly realized there was also no research and evidence base behind the work that we were doing. And that's when we said we needed to move from a service delivery model to see what the evidence is saying and what the research is saying, leading to the report today.
Great. Thank you, Colin. We could keep chatting about this for hours, but maybe in 30 seconds for our audience, if there's one learning, one key messages that you got from this involvement, what would this be?
The key learning for us, and I always believe is not enough time in the disaster world to learn from your own mistakes. So let's learn from other people's mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes we made was we made a lot of assumptions. We made assumptions that messages will get through, information will go through. There's a tick box approach to it. But very quickly, we realized making assumptions is one of the worst things you can actually do. The other big learning was is that you have to have an evidence-based approach to any work you're doing. If you can't monitor it, if you can't evaluate the work you're doing, don't do it. Mm-hmm. So that was a big learning for us. So that led to really put good practice in place to actually do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Colin, for showing the way, really, and for your advice and guidance over that journey. So I'm just going to turn off the camera now so we can focus on the slide for the next 20 minutes or so. So these efforts to involve culturally diverse communities into Red Cross work have continued since then, in particular from 2018 to 2020, through funding, as we discussed already, through the Natural Disaster Resilience Program. So, as Colin mentioned, during that period, we recruited a team of volunteers from diverse backgrounds who became an integral part of the Red Cross Emergency Services Program. And we really supported these volunteers for them to share the disaster preparedness message with their community in the way that they knew worked for their community. So in terms of what we actually did, we had a strong community engagement component with various community events. We had capacity building with training session, workshop presentations, with participation not only from CALD communities, but also from various disaster management and migration support agencies. And finally, we also developed some multilingual preparedness resources, which includes a short film and some flyers in different languages, which you can find on our website. And I'll just mention quickly that for these volunteers who contributed in so many different ways to this project, the benefits went well beyond being more prepared for disasters. It really allowed them to develop connections, skills, confidence, and I guess gain some experience by being involved in meaningful activities in disaster management. And it's fair to say that we learn from them at least as much as they learn from us. And I just want to say this project is only one of many initiatives that are currently being rolled out throughout the country to better involve culturally diverse communities into disaster management work. And we'll have the opportunity to showcase some of them later. So as we were having those conversations, those interactions with culturally diverse communities, we thought it'd be useful to document some of the stories that we were hearing and also reflect on the quite complex topic of disaster management in culturally diverse communities. And that led to a small research project, which ended up as a probably too long of a report, and whose objectives were really firstly to better understand these communities' experience with disaster, try to identify some of the factors that can make them more or less resilient to disruptions. And based on this, outline some really concrete actions that different stakeholders can take to contribute to a more culturally inclusive disaster management. So that research was based on conversations with 29 respondents, migrants, refugees, but also various people involved in disaster management and migration support. And we're obviously very grateful to them for having shared their stories and insight. And you'll be able to see quotes from these respondents in the upcoming slides. And that research was also based on a review of global literature, just to make sure we capture the learnings from other contexts as well. And for the more scholarly oriented people in our audience, I'll just briefly mention that there's a very interesting body of research on culturally inclusive disaster management, which brings insight from a variety of disciplines, including sociology, political science, anthropology, sociology, and others. And that body of research has been growing in the past decade or so, particularly after Hurricane Katrina in the US, in New Orleans, where they really notice a big gap in impacts and recovery outcomes between white and African Americans. And closer to home, I'd just like to mention this very interesting research made in New Zealand as well after the Canterbury earthquake, which led to some really interesting guidelines. Before we go further about talking about some of the insights of that research, there's a very obvious but important caveat that should precede any conversation about what we call CALD communities. And it's obviously the impossibility to generalize because of the extreme variety of what we call culturally diverse communities. Not unlike the variety we can see in the so-called mainstream communities. For example, the cultural differences that we might see in Australia between the rural and the urban communities, which also have implications for disaster management. So that said, let's take a moment now to reflect on the challenges and the opportunities of culturally inclusive disaster management. And I think a good way to understand the challenges in the very limited time that we have today is to do a little mental exercise and really try to put ourselves into the shoes of someone that we would call most vulnerable. So I'd like us to try, just for 1 minute or two, whether you're sitting in this room here or at home, perhaps in your office, to imagine that in the place where you live, in the place where you grew up, conflict erupts. There is violence and chaos around you, and you need to leave your home in a hurry. After perhaps several days of travel, you end up in a neighboring country, in a refugee camp, maybe separated from other members of your family. You don't know where they are, and you don't even know if they're still alive. You stay in this refugee camp for months, more likely years, where conditions are tough and life is harsh. Then, through a humanitarian program, you end up in yet another country, but this time much further away, about which you know practically nothing. The natural environment, the language, the culture, everything is unfamiliar. And you didn't choose to come here. But nonetheless, this is where you need to build a new life with all the challenges that this entails. So if this is your story, if this is what you've been through, what particular challenges you might face if a disaster comes your way? Well, firstly, you might not be familiar with the risks of disasters in this new country. Bushfires, for instance, you might never have encountered them before. You also might not understand English well, which prevents you to access information, allowing you to prepare, to cope with, and to recover from disasters. Also, perhaps the violence you experience in your country was partly carried out by a representative of government, the police or the army, leaving you with a kind of instinctual distrust of anyone wearing a uniform. And we've heard stories of how that mistrust really complicated, for example, evacuation orders when the police was knocking on the doors of recently arrived refugees in the middle of the night to help them evacuate. Well, it was very difficult because the last time that the police knocked on these people's door in the middle of the night, it was not to help them. And perhaps most importantly, the bushfire or the flood that you're going through is just one of your many concerns, because you also need to adapt to a new environment, learn a new language, find a job, all this while possibly dealing with a traumatic past and while you're hoping to reunite with family members that perhaps you still haven't heard from. So in those circumstances, it's quite obvious that thinking about preparing for a flood is probably the last thing on your mind, which ironically can make the consequences on your life even more severe. And this is what's called in the literature the problem of salience. So such stories are unfortunately numerous. We've heard many of them during our research, and we can definitely expect to hear more in the future, particularly following the announcement earlier this week by the Commonwealth government that international migration, including for humanitarian purposes, will resume. But by no means does this story represent the situation of the majority of people from a culturally diverse background. In fact, most are extremely resilient and resourceful. And just to give one example of that, during conversations that we've had with representatives of the Sikh religious community, we heard pretty amazing stories on how their tradition of strong community solidarity, but also communal meal preparation, allowed them to provide emergency relief food in large quantities and in very, very short time frames. Also important to note that resilience can be found in the most unexpected places, even in people that we qualify as most vulnerable. Because sometimes the hardship that people go through can actually be a tremendous source of strength, which is a fascinating phenomenon that we call post-traumatic growth, also for these scholarly people in our audience. And we've heard many stories showing this. For example, we interviewed refugees from East Africa who arrived in Townsville just a few months before a significant flood hit the town. And these refugees had to evacuate to an evacuation center. And we asked them what was their experience. And their answer was that, well, it was not a big deal for us because we spent years in a refugee camp where the conditions were much more difficult than in this evacuation center. Now I spoke from the point of view of a refugee, but that's just half the story. Because to fully understand the challenges of culturally inclusive disaster management, you also need to put yourself into the shoes of perhaps a disaster management officer in a rural government area, where the vast majority of the population is from an English-speaking European background, but where seasonal workers come every year for a few months. And while you know quite well how to engage with the mainstream population, how to communicate with them about risks, you might not feel confident reaching out to the migrant population. And you're not sure what's the best way to reach out and make sure they understand local risks. To use another example that I'm personally more familiar with, we can put ourselves in the shoes of perhaps a Red Cross volunteer deployed to manage an evacuation center in a bushfire impacted area. And in this evacuation center, there's a group of refugees who arrived to Australia just a couple of months ago. And while people are settling in the center, these refugees are trying to tell you something, but you don't speak their language, they don't have very good English, and communicating with them is very difficult, not only because of language, but also because of all the nonverbal aspects of communication. And that not only makes you uncomfortable as an evacuation center manager, but also a bit frustrated because there's so much to do in the evacuation center, and this cultural considerations adds significant challenges to an already challenging situation. So the challenges of culturally inclusive disaster management are pretty clear. But what about the opportunities? What opportunities we have to address them and how we can break them into manageable tasks? Now, to answer this question, I think it's useful to remind ourselves of one of the main tenets of disaster management in Australia, which is shared responsibility, as most of you would know. It simply means that everyone has their role to play into managing the impacts of disasters. And for me, who's not Australian, this really embodies the spirit of solidarity that I've seen here when things get tough. Local governments do their part, emergency services do theirs, including thanks to an amazing workforce of dedicated and qualified volunteers. And most importantly, the people, ordinary citizens, come out to help, getting dirty, cleaning up, donating funds, and supporting in so many other ways. And I think this idea of shared responsibility applies very well to the task of creating a more culturally inclusive disaster management sectors. Basically, it means that every one of us disaster management professionals and volunteers, service providers, community-based organizations, we all have our part to play in these efforts. Now, the final section of the research report outlines some very concrete actions that different stakeholders can take. So I won't go into the details of that in the interest of time, but I'll just mention two very general ideas. The first one is quite obvious, is to have a more diverse disaster management workforce. I mentioned at the start that about a third of Australia's population is born overseas. And even though we don't really have numbers about this, we can say confidently that much less than a third of the disaster management workforce is culturally diverse. And having a more culturally diverse disaster management workforce can make a real difference on the ground, in the field, so to speak. And we've heard the case, for example, of a Red Cross volunteer who spoke Swahili, who was deployed to an evacuation center in Queensland, coming from New South Wales. And he was able to not only translate and help with the communication with a group of refugees, also Swahili speaking in the evacuation center, but also provide a sense of comfort and familiarity to the people that were going through that quite challenging situation. And I think that this story shows that having a more culturally inclusive disaster management workforce is really something that we can and that we should aspire to. That won't happen overnight, obviously, but there's some small things that we can do, for example, targeted recruitment and more culturally inclusive communication. Now, the second general idea I'd like to mention is simply creating opportunities for connections. And what I mean by connections is connection between those migrant and refugee groups and disaster management agencies, service providers, etc. And we'll see some very concrete examples of that in a few moments when we'll be showcasing current projects. And it's also, of course, important to recognize the role that community-based organization can play. And we'll discuss this in a moment with my colleague, Paul Schmidt. So to conclude this part of our event, I'll just mention that while there are still many challenges ahead on the road to a more culturally diverse disaster management sector, tremendous progress was made with various initiatives being implemented throughout the country and an increased recognition of the importance of cultural factors in disaster management. And the fact that we have this event today with representatives from government, for instance, is itself, I think, a sign of positive change. And finally, there are tools out there to guide these efforts of having a more culturally inclusive disaster management sectors. For example, the guidelines for emergency management in CALD communities from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. You can also find some online training and some really great resources from local government that increasingly translate disaster information in several languages. So I'll keep it there. I'll stop sharing the screen. So I guess we talked a lot about natural disasters, floods, cyclones, but I think something quite significant happened in the last few years that also showed the challenges, but the opportunities of having a stronger inclusion of CALD communities in disaster communication. So to discuss this, we have Dr. Paul Schmidt, who is currently Community Connector Advisor for Red Cross. So Paul, please. So Paul, could you please maybe very shortly tell us what your role is about at Red Cross?
Sure, thanks Antoine, and hi everyone online. Just as we're talking, please use the chat function as well to share some of the lessons that you might have learned on this topic. But basically my role is around the engaging with response, recovery and resilience needs in terms of COVID for CALD communities across Queensland. And I do that by working through existing programs, organisations and networks wherever possible. And I know that a number of my partners and stakeholders are in the forum today. So that's why it'd be great if you can chip in with a few comments as we go along about some of the on-the-ground work that you've been doing. So the idea of my role is, as organisations and community leaders respond to the pressures of COVID, and there's always been a few surprises as we go along, my role can assist with sharing information and promoting collaboration, so it contributes to sort of sector-wide coordination, and it makes us all a bit more agile in responding. So, for example, I work to reduce duplication by linking with different projects funded from different parts of government, including the CALD COVID Health Engagement Project with Refugee Health. And we also share crisis communication. We've set up a WhatsApp group to try and link people that are involved in different communities and organisations that do messaging in Southeast Queensland.
Thank you. You just mentioned a WhatsApp group, Paul. That sounds like an interesting initiative. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure, and I'm sure that some people here are sick of hearing about WhatsApp groups. There's so many around now. But the idea of this WhatsApp group was because the networks are so complex in Southeast Queensland, there's so many stakeholders, there's so many communities that go across different local government areas. We wanted a way, I guess, to stay true to the idea of a single point of truth, of messaging around COVID coming out from government. And so we set up this group that I administer with Refugee Health Network. We also have people from Queensland Health that can feed translated resources into that. And so we're also feeding in plain English messaging. The members of the group, as I said before, people from different communities and services that have their own networks, and they have that on-the-ground knowledge about what's the information that people need. Will the plain English work, or should they translate it? And they can also, I guess, feedback to the administrators so that we can tweak the way we're doing it as we go along.
Wow. It sounds like that initiative involves the coordination of so many different agencies: disaster management, service providers, community organization. How you can coordinate such complex messaging with all those different agencies?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something we're looking at the moment. We're reviewing that and the WhatsApp group, but also there's been a whole range of crisis communication initiatives in Queensland. I guess I want to acknowledge some of the great consultation and co-design that's happened with service providers in regional areas in Brisbane, the way community leaders and health experts have come together on Zoom forums to, I guess, have a two-way approach to these things. And so that all contributes to coordination, but also I would say that what we're seeing is that people have different roles in crisis communication. You mentioned different roles before in terms of emergency management. And that's really what we're finding as well, is that community leaders have a very particular role. Health experts obviously can get the message out. Service providers can share things. But that's the real challenge moving forward, I guess, is how do we stick to our roles as in emergency management, the roles that are the best fit for our organisation, and especially in this case, allow community to take the lead in communications.
Yeah, well, seems like there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this work, Paul. And my last question for you would be, how do you think we can integrate what we've learned from a COVID context to a more general crisis management and disaster management context in terms of communication with culturally diverse groups?
Sure, and I hope everyone's putting their own comments in on this as well, that we're really at this stage of really identifying some of the lessons that have been learned and looking at how do we institutionalise that, how do we make that part of business as usual. I think Brandon and others have already mentioned that some of the general things around trust being critical, around having two-way, genuine communication is two-way. And that includes acknowledging that cultural leaders have expertise, cultural expertise, and we need to integrate that within this case, health expertise. It's not simply tell the leaders what they have to tell the community. It's a two-way thing.
Sure.
So in terms of disaster management, I guess this work is about extending communications into spaces where maybe crisis communications doesn't usually reach. It's about agencies also learning from community about how can we work with community to engage with these structural barriers in the short term to lower them, and also to accompany communities and learn from them as they build their resilience over the longer term and their inclusion into things like disaster management and other parts of society.
Wow. Fantastic. Now, thank you so much, Paul. Very important work there. And I think it shows very well how crisis can be used as opportunities, in that case, for better communication with culturally diverse groups. So
great. Thanks, Antoine. And thanks, everyone, for those of you participating with my work.
Thanks. So we have 25 minutes left maximum. We might finish a bit early, which I think most people will be happy about. So as I mentioned earlier, there are currently many projects going on that strive to involve culturally diverse communities into disaster management. And we're lucky to have the coordinator of one of them today with us that joins online. It's Jane Williamson, who is coordinator for the Community Action for a Multicultural Society program in Toowoomba. And we also joined by Moshka, one of the volunteers who participates in the project. So Jane, if you want to turn your camera and your sound on, please.
Okay, I think I've done that now.
Yeah,
Antoine, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Jane. That's fantastic.
Wonderful.
So for those of you who might not be very familiar with the Queensland geography, Toowoomba is a regional city, about an hour and a half west of Brisbane, and it is highly multicultural. So my first question for you, Jane, would be, could you briefly describe what kind of groups and how Toowoomba is culturally diverse?
I can, but thank you, Antoine. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having us on board and good morning to other prominent guests and workers in this field. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Gabal and Jarowa elders of the Toowoomba region, past, present and future, and in particular their trials and tribulations and their thousands of years of environmental challenges that we can learn so much from for Aboriginal people to become the longest living culture in the world. So, along with Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, Pacific Islander peoples in Toowoomba, we have up to 32 different language groups, including many people who have now resided here from Africa, originally arriving as refugees, but now very much Queenslanders. We have Sudanese, Congolese, Chad, Kenyan, Nigerian, Ethiopian, and other African nations. From the Middle East, we have Afghan, Irani, Pakistani, Kurdistan, Iraqi, Syrian, Palestinian, Bangladesh, Sri Lankan. We have Indian, Thai, Indonesian, Filipino, the list goes on. And of course, many migrants who have moved here from the many different European countries. So as you have stated, across Queensland and indeed Australia, Toowoomba is a very multicultural society now.
Wow, that's incredibly diverse for such a city. That's fantastic. So Toowoomba, in addition to being very highly multicultural, experienced its share of disasters over the past few years. There was a significant flood in 2010-11, but also the bushfires in 2019 that affected the city quite badly. So, Jane, just curious to hear from you, what have we learned from these disasters about communicating with culturally diverse groups in your city?
I think we've learned a lot, Antoine, and more recently, of course, from the COVID experiences, we've learned a lot about the opportunities and, of course, the challenges and complexities required to strengthen our connections and communications with the very enormous amount of CALD community groups residing in Toowoomba. What we have learned is that many of these groups are currently less likely to receive communication or adequate communication due to their specific challenges such as low English proficiency, poor knowledge of local risks, and lack of inclusion in, previous disaster management activities. The other thing that we learnt that we've been responding to in particular is that many women in particular from many of these diverse communities don't read or write in their own language, let alone in English. So we've had to respond to that in different ways. And that's included not only translating documents into the different languages, but if you don't read or write in your own language, and often it's women in all cultures, particularly even Australian, who are the organisers of these disaster preparations, that we needed to do a lot of work more with visual icons so that it would work across the whole community.
Yeah, it's so interesting that the gender aspect is actually a very important part of cultural factors in disaster management, and it's interesting how it showed up in your project. Now, if we kind of focus on your project itself, Jane, and if you can just take us through, especially for the people on the line who might be keen to engage with culturally diverse communities, so how it started and how did you reach out to groups that are sometimes hard to reach, particularly refugee groups? How did you make this happen?
Thanks, Antoine. Well, fortunately, the CAMS project at Mercy Community has been running for some time, as well as we have Multicultural Australia in Toowoomba. We have the Trans project through Catholic Care. Of course, we have the university and many other organisations that are working very closely with CALD communities. So first of all, we developed a little bit of a strategic committee to look at how we were going to approach this with ourselves and other organisations, but in particular with local community leaders. And one of the learnings from that was we were being very careful we were thinking about, we don't want to develop a project that's going to trigger people who've come from war zones. And a very lovely, gentle Sudanese man reminded us of the strengths that has been discussed in this presentation today, that they have developed from those war zones, and not to be too considerate of the triggering, that people are well aware. So what became most, I suppose, prominent for us was more so the triggering of people in uniforms. Anyway, so we developed the strategic committee, and then from there, community leaders reached out to their own communities for volunteers to become ambassadors, and that we would train those and have those ambassadors throughout the whole year in the various processes along the continuum of disaster management.
Great, fantastic. And that ambassador model, I think, has a huge potential, and sometimes it's called champions, community leaders, but having people who really know their community and they're able to convey important messages is probably one of the strongest tool that we have to reach for these communities. Just two more questions for you, Jane. You mentioned that there can be a lack of trust between disaster management authorities and culturally diverse groups because of their past experience. What do you think can be done to develop that trust, to bridge that gap?
Antoine, I'm going to let Mushkan answer that question. And before we go any further, I'd particularly like to thank you for your contribution to the training, bringing your knowledge and also wonderful training skills that did help to develop a wonderful contribution, but most of all, camaraderie amongst the group that we now work with, 25 people. From all different language groups. But when we talk about trust, if I may, I'm going to allow Mushkan, who has been working with me on this project, and you, to talk a little bit about trust and why that exists, and therefore what we are doing to try and counter some of that.
Sure. Well, welcome, Mushka. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mushka Namdari. I am working with Jane in Toowoomba. I think about trust. I think the people who work in between the organization and the people who are from the other background, the people who can speak their language and make a bridge between organization, and these people can be so important, because when some people like me can speak their language and translate their language, we can make this bridge and relationship and trust between these people and their organization. And then we can invite the people, give them some information session, and explain for them how the different organizations want to help them. And I think this is one of the key elements for make that trust and prepare them to work with that organization. So,
yeah. I think, as was mentioned earlier, particularly in their own countries, people in uniform are not necessarily knocking on the door to help them. So we have brought in people from the various emergency services, QFES, from hospitals, from ambulance, from SES, from police, to meet with the group, talk about what their role is during an evacuation, to build some of that trust that they are here to help, but that during a crisis, they'll probably be quite robust and very directional, but that's not something to be afraid of. And that's worked very well. And with a lot of thanks to people like Mushka, who have been part of the project and helped talking to the people in their own languages about the role of different authorities and indeed themselves in a disaster.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that experience. And it really shows that sometimes all you need to do to initiate those contact and that trust is just having a meet and greet, as you've had in your project, with representative of the police, the emergency services and other disaster management, and these groups that can just get to know each other a little bit. And your project is a very, very good example of this. So maybe last very short question, Jane, if I may. If there's one learning from this project that you would like to share with our audience, what would this be?
It's great fun.
It was actually, yeah.
And I think I have to say that because of people's experiences and their strengths from those experiences, we have learned a lot. So in our next round, we're hoping to take quite a few of the ambassadors who have been involved in this round further forward next year. We will probably add some facilitation skills so that it's easier for them to go to their own communities to discuss what they've learnt. And I guess what we're hoping now to do is ask those people with those previous skills and what they've learnt with your wonderful training and our partnership with Toowoomba Regional Council Disaster Management Team, Jenna Buckley, to work with ambassadors next year as part of their progress of moving forward as well, so that we can continue to get out to the rest of the community and build on their experiences.
Fantastic. Jane and Moshka, thank you so much for sharing your experience, and we really hope that it can be an inspiration for anyone on the call today to do those little actions that can have significant impacts in reaching out to culturally diverse communities. So thanks so much, Jen and Moshka.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you to Paul Schmidt, who's also helped and introduced us to you, and of course, Multicultural Affairs Queensland for the funding to be able to progress this project. Thanks, Antoine. Best of luck.
Goodbye, Jane. So we have one final guest to close our event today, and I guess to provide another mini case study on what are the actions that can be implemented to contribute to a more culturally inclusive disaster management sector. But this time it's from the local government perspective. So online today we have Faye Gibson, who is Community Capability and Disaster Resilience Officer for the Brisbane City Council. So Faye, can you join us by turning your camera and sound? You're here.
Oh, hello everyone. Thank you, Antoine. I'm sorry if my camera's not working. I've had some issues. It's 2021. I don't know why. I still don't know how to use Zoom. Proficient in Teams. Proficient in Microsoft Teams though. So good morning everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really passionate in this space, so I'm so excited to be part of this conference webinar. I'd like to firstly acknowledge our traditional custodians of the land, in particular the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, elders past, present and emerging. So I'll kick off, Anton. I'll tell you guys about a little bit about my role. So I work in the City Resilience branch, formerly known as Disaster Management. We recently had a name change because we believe our team represents more resilience than response. So we have 14 roles within our team, around 8 in the city and 8 that support the Brisbane City SES unit. So my role is mainly around fostering disaster resilience and community capability within Brisbane. So I've been in this role for around 5 years, and for most of that time I've been a one-woman band running an annual community engagement and communication campaign to encourage Brisbane residents and Brisbane businesses to prepare for severe weather and bushfires, pandemics, all of that sort of stuff. Fun stuff, as we're all talking about. So each year, sorry, you go, Antoine.
Please go ahead, Faye. Sorry.
Oh no, you're right. So each year I'm always looking for opportunities to continuously improve on my previous year's engagement strategy. I never change or remove initiatives that I've implemented. I just keep adding on because I want to keep my commitment, or the council's commitment, to our residents to always service that information and engagement around disaster preparedness. So I feel for the person that ever takes on my role, because there's so much. I run it like a well-oiled machine. So since commencing in the role, I developed, I sort of changed it a lot. So before I came into this team, this role was mainly focusing just on a marketing campaign. So I've, let's say, renovated the role into some more face-to-face community engagements. I developed the My Resilient Schools program that targets years 5 and 6. Created bushfire engagement programs. So I partnered with Queensland Fire Emergency Services and the Royal Fire Brigade to target the really at risk for our geographically vulnerable areas. Flood risk information sessions and flood awareness programs, working in with community groups who lead their own emergency management evacuation planning. For example, the Moggle Men's Shed and the State School. So in 2011, the Belbarry Moggle community became an island with no access to pharmacies, groceries, hospitals, doctors. So they are one example, pioneering example of a Brisbane community group. Also running events at the Brisbane Home Show, targeting an audience that are interested in home improvement, community information hubs in at-risk areas, and a new one is non-perishable cooking demonstrations. So if you're stuck at home and isolated, what can you cook from your pantry for 3 to 5 days to keep things interesting?
Well, this sounds like a quite big role, Faye. I'm sure you have a lot on your plate at the moment. Thank you for sharing this. I'd just like to ask you, we've talked a lot about what migrants and refugee group might need in times of disasters. But what about you? What about do you need as a local government disaster manager to reach out to culturally diverse communities? What kind of information would you need, for example?
All right, so over the last 5 years, I've been exploring the journey of refugees, international students, recent migrants, settled migrants on when they move to Brisbane. So I'm finding what I'm really needing is more information around perception pre and post arrival. I guess learning more about who our multicultural communities talk to regarding personal safety and disaster preparedness, understanding how messages are currently being received, and how our called communities would essentially like to receive this information. Awareness of specific communications. Like is early warning alert service the best way to reach our called communities, or are there other channels that I don't know about? I guess an understanding of circumstances and levels of hazard knowledge. And the last one, connections with called groups through relevant organizations. So, um, over the last 5 years, I have built connections, obviously, with you, Antoine and Paul Schmidt and Colin. You guys have been amazing and linking me in with other organisations. I'm working with like Ethnic Communities Council Queensland, but are there, any other organisations that I'm not aware of, or that in Brisbane that we're not aware of that we can, help continuously learn and reach our called communities.
Right. No, thank you. So the need for information, for connections, and I think the example of Jane just before you showed well how these connections can be established. So last question for you, if you can try to answer in 3 minutes. I know that there's much things to say, but if you can just quickly describe what the Brisbane City Council is doing at the moment to reach out to culturally diverse communities.
Of course. So I might start with where we were and where we're at now, if that's all right, Antoine.
Sure.
So I noticed in the chat, Belinda mentioned earlier around translated material and not landing in the hands of our called communities. So that's where we were. We have translated material in Chinese, both simplified and traditional, Arabic, Korean, Vietnamese, Punjabi, Hindi, and Spanish. And we also have our early warning alert service translated in 4 languages. That's Chinese, Arabic, Korean, and Vietnamese. So we've been translating information material, newspaper articles, digital advertising, in areas where we know there's a high proportion of our called community. And we've been using the 2016 census data. So although we were doing some good work in that space, we knew that we weren't reaching our called communities still. And knowing that the translated materials weren't landing in the hands of our called communities, because it was obvious when we were running, of our community engagements at multicultural events where we'd talk to them around and they'd see the translated material and not know who the SES are or who to call. So we understood that there was a huge gap in reaching our called communities, and we met with an organisation, Zuchi, who work with us in our evacuation centres, and they were talking through some different strategies that could support us. So moving forward this financial year, so Brisbane City Council, we've been working with Red Cross and the Ethnic Communities Council Queensland in developing a train the trainer model. Initially, we're running this as a pilot for the first year, but what I'm really hoping is to have this as a permanent program every year, because called communities are going to continue to grow in Australia, and I really want to continue supporting our called communities. So this program has been developed in a way where ECCQ and Red Cross has run community consultation with 5 language groups, and they've provided us in Brisbane City Council that feedback on what the language groups require. Sorry, my manager just dropped a coffee off at my desk. Thank you very much. So utilising that information, we've developed a wonderful presentation where we've used, it's sort of like where we tell a story. So instead of coming at our called communities in just saying, prepare for this, create an emergency kit, sign up to our early warning alert service, we want to take them through what a Brisbane storm actually does feel and look like. And we've used an animation program called Beyond, and I'm more than happy to share that with everyone that's attending this webinar. just so you can see how it's being presented. So was it last Monday, Antoine?
Sorry, what?
That we it was last Monday
yeah,
or the
last
Monday
week.
before?
Last week.
Yeah, so last week, Antoine and I actually ran the workshop with the 5 bilingual workers from ECCQ to help them learn and understand what messaging from a local government perspective we're trying to get out to our CALD communities. And that way they can take that information away and also use that presentation and then adapt that into their own format to help their communities. So ECCQ are going to run 20 train the trainer sessions until June next year. And then we'll review the program, review lessons learned and update the program where we need to and continuously run that program next financial year. And we're a huge thank you to QRA, Brendan Moon, and Get Ready Queensland funding for funding this project for us. So another one that I'm so sorry if we're going over time, Antoine, but I'm really proud of this.
We'll need to wrap it up in a few seconds, Faye, if you can.
Okay, can I quickly talk about Radio 4EB? I'll be really quick. So Radio 4EB heard about our engagement with ECCQ and made a commitment to Brisbane City Council of training their 50 language group broadcasters around disaster preparedness and key messaging when there's a storm alert, a flood alert, or a pandemic. So this is something I'm really proud of. It's bridging that gap because Radio 4EB, most of their listeners, that's where they get the only source of information, of primary local community information. So it's really exciting that they now have the tools and that they're working with Brisbane City Council's City Resilience team in broadcasting any severe weather forecast or alerts. And then obviously if there is a disaster, crisis comms.
Fantastic.
Sorry for going over time.
No, that's okay. No, thank you so much for sharing this. And I think it really shows what local governments can do. And what you've been saying is a mix of different medium, reaching out to multilingual radio, translating material, but also that face-to-face engagement and the establishment of connection, which is probably the most important thing we can do. So thank you so much, Faye, for sharing this. So this concludes this event for today at exactly 11 a.m. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. I think it really shows a strong commitment to community-led, people-centered, and culturally competent disaster management. I hope that the event today made you reflect on the importance of multiculturalism for disaster management and about the role you can play in this as well. But most of all, depending on who you are, whether you're from disaster management or perhaps community-based organization, I really hope that what we discussed today will inspire you to reach out to the culturally diverse communities that may be in your areas, or to the disaster management agencies to really continue to establish those connections.